All right. So the system here is that I will be served questions from you that arrived at Sut's desk, and I'll be reading up. Some of these questions will be directed to one of you, but feel free to chip in if you want to do that, any one of you. So this is mainly for Ken. Why do you think that US-based human rights organizations have been unable to move beyond simply an apartheid framework and into a settler colonialism analysis that starts at the start of the Zionist movement?
I think the answer to that is simply that human rights groups basically start with UN recognition of governments. And so we accept that Israel's reality. We accept it within the 67 borders. So it doesn't, we don't say, oh, the US shouldn't exist because it's a settler colonial society, or Australia shouldn't exist. We just accept the UN member states as they are and then hold them to international standards. So Israel is recognized within the 67 borders. Beyond that, it's an occupying power. And the forever occupation, which is not being resolved by the non-existent peace process, is apartheid. So that's how we get there.
So a question from Mohammed. Art, especially poetry, has held a long-standing legacy in Palestinian liberation. With your book, Rivka, you have joined that legacy. How has poetry shaped resistance in Palestine? How has it influenced your imagination of a free Palestine?
Thank you. You can hear me? We're Palestinians are Arab people, and in Arabic, poetry has long played a historical role, both in the revolutionary sense, in the sense of shedding light on the plight of the poor, on the plight of the worker, on the plight of the colonized, but also poetry has been like kind of a tool to like sing the praises of the king. Now this is not the case anymore, and people don't appreciate it as much, but in our household I grew up with a lot of poetry. My mother was a poet, and in fact her and my father would play this game where my mother would write a poem, and they would guess which lines of hers would be taken out by the Israeli military censor when she would submit them to the local paper. So you could see how poetry was inherently politicized, in my view. My favorite example to give about poetry and just general literature in general is this poet called God is a Refugee. This poem called God is a Refugee. It's a sarcastic, sardonic poem that was written by Rashid Hussein in the 60s. And it was a poet that kind of ridicules the Israeli absentee law, the property absentee law, which kind of said that all of the homes and the properties of the refugees that were forcibly expelled in the establishment of the Israeli state are now state-owned. And he's just joking in the poem, and he's saying, God is now a refugee, so why don't you take the church also, and you can have the mosque because it's his property, and you can take the orphans since their father is a refugee too. You can just take whatever you want. But effectively, what he was doing with this poem is that he was explaining and bypassing the bureaucracy of the law that is oftentimes meant to be illegible to the everyday farmer, to the everyday worker whose land and whose property was taken by the Israeli state. And not only did it work to sensitize and translate what these laws and bureaucracies that often, again, alienate the poor and alienate the working class, it also worked to fuel these very classes into resistance. And I don't think my particular literary contribution does that, but I hope that one day it does. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Now I have a question for both of you. Dr. Ghassan Abu Sita yesterday talked about, in quotation marks, the day after. referring to after the bombing and warfare stops. Do you believe there is a day after? What are important considerations and actions that we need to know about when it comes to the day after? Any one of you could begin.
I mean, in my opinion, I think all of us in this room, play a big role in whether there is a day after or not. Again, although Gaza is this faraway planet that is being bombed into smithereens, it's being done in your name, in your tax dollars, but also we here have the potential to pressure the United States government, which has a lot of influence over the Israeli government, to stop its bombardment. It's easy for us to think about these events once they've passed, decades after they've passed. It's easy to have moral clarity in the past tense and say, like, if I were alive during Jim Crow, I would have acted with principle, I would have acted with moral courage, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But today we are watching history pass us by, and everything we do to counteract it, to interact with it, will be held against us, even by our own consciousness. So it's important to think about the day after as something we're all active agents in conjuring. So I know that was a roundabout way of answering the question, but here's my answer.
That works fine.
All right. Well, maybe we should talk for a moment just about, what is it likely to look like to get to that day after, to begin with? Because I actually think that the end of this active armed conflict phase, it's almost predictable what it's going to look like at that point. At some stage, initially there's going to be, a women and children hostage for women and children prisoner exchange. That's going to come fairly soon. Then there's, at some point, going to be an all hostage for all prisoner exchange. And whichever Hamas leaders survive the bombardment, they are going to agree to go to Qatar, sort of the way the PLO leadership agreed to go to Tunis in whatever it was, 1992, I guess, I don't know, whatever, a long time ago. It's going to be some kind of political settlement like that, which of course completely then begs the question, how do you treat the Palestinian people who remain? And the Israeli government position is, look what Hamas just did to us. We can't possibly trust these people. We need to keep them completely fenced in forever. We can't possibly trust a Palestinian state. And that is totally not a long-term solution. And if you sort of think about it, while there's a clear racist element here, the Israeli government has somehow come to recognize that it can live with Jordan, it can live with Egypt, it can live with Saudi Arabia. These are not perceived as posing mortal threats. And the only difference between those states and the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza is that there's no occupation in those other places. And that it's not even as if, it's not even the dispossession of the Nakba, because if you look in Jordan, Jordan's a Palestinian majority state. There are many Jordanians who were dispossessed from their homes that were once in Israel. And even that is not deemed as posing a mortal threat to the state of Israel. So the essence of it is the occupation. But the current kind of far-right approach of the Israeli government is you just got to crush the Palestinians and then crush them some more, and ultimately they'll accept their fate, which is basically, an apartheid answer. And so, the big open question, because Netanyahu will never have a conversion. He's just sort of stuck where he is. But he's not going to be the prime minister for very long. Somebody's going to come in who is, not in the left, but it'll be sort of more of a moderate figure. But will the combination of that new Israeli leadership, plus, will there be any recognition in Western governments that this current approach that's been going on now for, 30 plus years, is not working, and something radically different has to be done? And it's really only going to be that possibility that would lead to, the kind of significant changes that would have to take place. Really, the dismantling or the transfer of the vast majority of the settlements, and the willingness to turn over to a genuine, Palestinian leadership, not Hamas and not the Palestinian Authority, which is utterly discredited and corrupt, but something else that's got to be allowed to emerge that could be, seen as having legitimacy with the Palestinian people to make the kind of compromises that would be needed to then make peace with the Israelis. And these are all, kind of wishful thinking, best case scenario kinds of things, but that's what it's going to take. But it's nowhere near where we are right now. And I think we can only hope that we can sort of nudge things in that direction, because the alternative, which is more of the same, is going to be more misery and more violence and not security for anybody, not security for Palestinians or Israelis.
Mohammed, what would you say is the proper role to be played for a Muslim Palestinian living in the diaspora on a college campus such as this one?
I don't think religion of the person matters that much in the role they have to play. I mean, I think that's a significant point to be made, is that this struggle is often characterized as some kind of religious war, and that is, frankly, a losing battle. This is a struggle about land, and I think the role that has to be played not just by Palestinians, but by anybody in the diaspora, myself included, is to put things into perspective. I go around campuses all the time, and I hear from a lot of students who are afraid of losing academic prospects, professional prospects, who are afraid of social isolation and ostracization. And I recognize these fears. They're certainly clear, and they're also not without teeth. I mean, we're seeing the FBI now investigate Palestinian activists. We're seeing Palestinian groups and even Jewish groups be shut down and disbarred and suspended around various Ivy League and just universities in this country. So these fears are real. But I must insist that they just do not compare to living under military occupation. They simply do not compare to the violence of living under military occupation, and there is no struggle without sacrifice. I think a great example of this is there was an art forum, which is a big, art magazine here in the United States. There was an art forum incident where, like, the art editor edited this letter of thousands of artists who were standing in solidarity with the Palestinian people, and then the letter was deleted, and then the editor himself was fired. And that is, kind of a personal price that this other editor had to pay. But in the long term, this kind of discrimination created a major national conversation around censorship and the suppression of pro-Palestinian advocacy, and it has even opened more and more people's eyes to the reality of what's going on. So this is one role I think Palestinians and allies, particularly students, have to play. A second role is that we must not be distracted. I think a lot of us, we all come from various political avenues, and we have different political opinions. And the very nature of Israeli propaganda and Zionist propaganda is to discredit our activism, our advocacy, and so on. And so we get caught in these discursive battles, oftentimes trying to debate whether what's legitimate and what's not legitimate. I mean, a big issue that I've been seeing over the past few weeks is the "From the River to the Sea" slogan, and all of that controversy that it has created. Now, there is this idea that this is a genocidal slogan, and I can push back against that idea, and I can say, it's not a genocidal slogan. It just means that there needs to be freedom and equality granted for all people that live between the river and the sea. And yes, indeed, some interpretations of it, including my own, might mean the dismantling of the apartheid regime, the dismantling of the Zionist regime that is only sustained through land theft and through ethnic cleansing and through racial supremacy and through hegemonies. Yes, but I want to like take the radical position and say that even if this is a offensive slogan, there is one side that is currently flattening entire residential neighborhoods. And yet that very systemic, very material violence is not taking the stage, and we are spending a lot of our time discussing the semantic violence in a vague phrase. And thank you, it's okay. Thank you, and we must not be distracted by this. I think our biggest concern here, and I echo the calls that we're hearing from our friends in Gaza, is calling for a ceasefire and not stopping until not only has there been a ceasefire, but also, you know, an end of the siege, an end of the occupation, an end of the apartheid system. Thanks.
So I have a question for Ken. Does international law cover internal cleansing? In the context of Israel and Palestine, is Israel's denial of rights for its Palestinian population covered by international law? Or can the Israeli state frame it as bombing of Gaza as internal, as it does not recognize Palestine, so as to deny international law's application?
No. No, I mean, international human rights law is about how a government treats its own people. You know, international humanitarian law is about how you fight a war, which could be an internal conflict, you know, a civil war, or an international conflict. So, no, I mean, Israeli treatment of any Palestinian, you know, within the 67 boundaries or within the occupied territory is covered by international law. There's no getting out of that.
I have a follow-up question on that, and I'm wondering about the framing of the prisoners, the Palestinian prisoners in Israel. More than 5,000. They are described as administrative prisoners, or sometimes sentenced, but mostly they don't get even a trial. Some of them are children. Are they possible to understand as hostages taken by the Israeli state, or is it impossible for a state to take hostages?
Well, no, states take hostages. I mean, look at, you know, I mean, Iran does it, China does it. I mean, they're, you know, usually when you think about hostages, though, it is taking, you know, somebody from another country. So I think most of the people who are, well, I guess it's a mixture. I don't know how many are from Gaza because they don't invade Gaza that often, but a lot are from the West Bank and East Jerusalem. But no, if you ask who the prisoners are, some are convicted after trials. Many are so-called administrative detainees, which means that there's never a criminal trial. There's basically the Israeli intelligence service says, you know, we know what this person did, but we're not going to show you the evidence. We're going to give the evidence secretly to a judge. There's going to be no opportunity for the person's lawyer to challenge the evidence because it's secret. And on the basis of this, you know, secret unilateral proceeding, you are going to get detained. And so that's what the administrative detainees are. And you know, this is not, you know, a human rights compliant process. My understanding is that what, you know, Hamas is looking for now is a trade of all the hostages for all the prisoners, meaning both administrative detention and criminal convicts.
Thank you.
Can I add something?
Yes,
I also want to add that in the past month, the number of Palestinians, I would argue, taken hostage by the Israeli state has almost doubled. And we are seeing this in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in 1948 territories where Palestinians are pulled from their homes, oftentimes preemptively, like what happened in Jaffa on the second day of the Israeli military operation in the Gaza Strip, where 20, 30 Palestinians from Jaffa were taken from their homes. And what we're seeing more often in the past few days, in the past few weeks, is people taking over social media posts. And we are seeing the Israeli, the parliament now legalizing or attempting to legalize an amendment to the counterterrorism law that says if you as much consume what they consider terrorist media or terrorist press, which is very vague and very broad, you could be taken to jail for almost a year. Another thing that has not received media attention much is that, there's thousands of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip who work with Israeli bosses and Israeli companies who, when the October 7 attack happened, were taken hostage without any charge, without any trial, simply because they're from Gaza. And I also want to say that they were not only taken hostage and abducted by the Israeli side, but also by the Palestinian Authority. And a lot of this we have not heard about except through citizen journalists and except through word of mouth and except through our own personal connections. I mean, one of my closest friends is from Gaza, but her whole family is in Gaza, but she's married in Jerusalem, and 3 of her uncles were just released by the Israeli military onto Gaza. My neighbor, who lives right across the house from me, whose home was also taken in 2008, lingers in prison for the past 3 weeks over a song she shared on Instagram. My other neighbor, Alisar, she's an art student at an Israeli university in Jerusalem, and her Israeli classmate said that she and her social media presence made them feel unsafe, and so she was taken for 3-4 days without any charges, nothing. She was just taken, interrogated extensively, and then released in the middle of the night. And we're hearing more and more and more about this. Even my lawyer, I was supposed to be in Palestine, and my lawyer called me and he said, I think it's best not that you don't go because they're kind of engaging arbitrarily. And these things, because of the gravity, one, because of the gravity of the bombardment, but also 2, because of the complacency or complicity of Western media, these are things that we're not hearing about. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Ken, per international humanitarian law, targeting journalists is a war crime. Yet Israel proudly and loudly has said that the journalists on the ground in Gaza are Hamas mouthpieces. How is the targeting of journalists being allowed, and why is it hard for journalists at the BBC and other news outlets or governments to call for international protection of at least the people who are giving the information we would not otherwise have?
Well, it is a war crime to target journalists. Journalists are civilians, they're not combatants. It's a war crime to target them. Is Israel trying to cover up what it's doing in Gaza? Yes. So it's trying to make it difficult for journalists to be there, and it's doing everything it can to impede their work. But being a journalist is an honored, legitimate profession, and it does not turn you into a military combatant, even if you're reporting about the other side's war crimes.
If I can pressure you there, I think the question is about why is this not happening? Why is it not being affected? Why is not the protection happening? Why is the international law so weak here?
Well, the bigger question is, why is Israel getting away with having killed 11,000 Palestinian civilians in a little over a month? And the journalists are among them, but most people being killed are just kids. And, that's the largest contingent, is just kids. So if you sort of look at, who has influence over Israel, there's some domestic discontent, but for the most part, people are going along with Netanyahu. Clearly the government with the most influence is the US government. And, Biden's initial reaction seemed mostly to be about, avoiding any distance between himself and the Republican Party. And so he just, 100% embraced Israel, said, we're with you on this. This was a terrible attack. There was a sort of perfunctory reference put into, oh yeah, by the way, respect humanitarian law. but no teeth to that, nothing. Now, that has evolved mainly in the realm of humanitarian access. And so the US government has been pushing to allow more humanitarian aid in, for a humanitarian pause. It has not been willing to criticize Israeli violations of humanitarian law. Again, there are these references, you should abide by humanitarian law. At one point they said, why don't you drop smaller bombs than a 2,000-pound bomb in the middle of a refugee camp? So there's kind of modest pressure in that direction, but no criticism and no description in legal terms of what's happening. No saying, you're flouting humanitarian law, you're committing war crimes. You don't get that. And as long as the US government is seen as basically giving a green light, maybe saying, provide a little more humanitarian aid, don't shut down the hospitals, but no real impediment to the ongoing bombing, the bombing is going to continue and civilians are going to be killed. And so, this is an area where politics in this country matter a whole lot. Because, if Biden starts feeling the heat for his embrace of the Israeli government position, that's one form of pressure that will matter. And I think, Biden, who really, his instinct is always to think about, okay, who are, not the crazy far-right MAGA Republicans, but, who are the sort of independents or the centrist Republicans whom he could get. And he's always thinking in those terms about just that, little next notch on the political spectrum in order to kind of win a swing state. And he tends to ignore his base. And I think, he needs to start hearing from his base that this matters to people. And it's not just about, moving a small sliver on the political spectrum in the center, but it's also about mobilizing the base. And if he's going to demobilize the base because people are so upset with how he is responding to the bombing in Gaza, that's something he may gradually begin to worry about, which would in turn leave him with the capacity to influence Netanyahu.
Thank you. Mohammed, does Israel need Hamas to justify what it wants to do anyway? If Hamas did not exist, Israel would have to invent it? Or what do you think?
Historically, Israeli atrocities have existed long before Hamas has. And there's all this kind of talk about, the Israeli government uplifting or funding or abetting Hamas to kind of undermine the secular parties or blah, blah, blah. I'm not necessarily interested in those, be they fact or not. Hamas, in my opinion, is a political movement that I disagree with, that I also have very, very, very limited ability to discuss openly because of the laws in this country and of the laws that exist back home where I live. But to answer the question plainly, no, absolutely not. They do not need an excuse to bomb us. They do not need an excuse to dispossess us. They do not need an excuse to take our lands. They can, and I mean, in the past few days, we have been seeing, at first it started with a kind of conflation of Hamas with ISIS and saying that Hamas is like the Taliban and that there's absolutely no political demands on the part of Hamas and they're just kind of like rabid, mindless people acting mindlessly and as though they don't have any political project or political demands or blah, blah, blah. Despite the means, I'm not commenting on the means, the methods. But that conflation failed, and now we're kind of seeing, some more ridiculous justifications. I mean, this afternoon, the Israeli military released a video claiming that it showcased the schedule of the Hamas combatants, where they, take shifts guarding Israeli hostages. Come to find out, it's just a table with the days of the week on it. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, right? And then you have other claims, like an Israeli an clearly Israeli actress pretending to be a hijabi woman who's a nurse who's talking in the most very obvious Israeli accent and the worst Arabic possible. It's like very laughable. And at the beginning, I think of it as like super ridiculous and they're not really good at propaganda, but something in me, and this might be like some kind of conspiracy theory, but something in me thinks like, oh, they recognize that they will never be scrutinized. They recognize that everybody is turning a blind eye, not even turning a blind eye. Most major governments, most superpowers are aiding and abetting them, are funding them. So they're just playing in our faces. They're ridiculing us because under normal circumstances, should journalists do their jobs, a video like that would not be circulated so widely. A quote-unquote document from the Taliban that I can just Google right now and get a PDF of would not serve as damning evidence. But there's already this demonization of Palestinians, this dehumanization. And again, I argue, we are just simply not seen as human. When the war in Ukraine started, the New York Post hailed a Ukrainian suicide bomber as a war hero. And I thought I was having psychosis because I thought, suicide bombing was the one thing you don't talk about. And then I turn on the news, I turn on the TV on Sky News, and they're hosting a Molotov cocktail making workshop. Again, psychosis, because I thought we're not supposed to do this. And then the New York Times ran this interview with this Ukrainian psychologist who said that hatred for Russians is a healthy outlet. And yet we grow up being told that even the little disdain we might have for our oppressors is animal-like and barbaric. So the issue lies with the kind of free passes that the world grants Israel, but it also lies in the very treatment and the very interpretation the world has of Palestinian life and Palestinian humanity. And that, at its core, needs to be addressed. There needs not to be only an end and a stopping to the bombing and to the land theft, but we need to contend as a world with the dehumanization, the decades-long dehumanization of the Palestinian people that made their mass slaughter acceptable. Thank you.
Ken, what would you say to the argument that Israelis offered the Palestinians a state multiple times, but Palestinians refused each offer?
Well, there were lots of caveats to that offer of a state, but it sort of doesn't matter. That was 30 years ago. If Israel was serious about, wanting to come to a two-state solution, it would have come back and negotiated further. But instead, what happened was, Rabin was killed, and you had a bunch of right-wing governments that came in Israel who had zero interest in a peace process. And so there's been no negotiation, nothing, for years. The question about Hamas, Netanyahu loved Hamas, because it was a completely unacceptable negotiating partner. Meanwhile, he did everything he could to discredit the Palestinian Authority, which did plenty to discredit itself because it's so corrupt and it refuses to hold an election. But, how do you, imagine here you have this government that's nominally in charge, and you just keep expanding and expanding and expanding the settlements and adding outposts and adding bypass roads. And this territory that supposedly the Palestinian Authority is running, is just chopped up and chopped up and chopped up. So there's nothing even close to a contiguous state. That's going to have no credibility and also cannot be a negotiating partner. And so, the Israeli government was very smart. They just, made sure there was nobody to negotiate with, and they could come in and say, 30 years ago we offered them a state, and they said no, and nothing's going forward. Now it's their fault. And that's kind of the very one-dimensional, view of the whole thing, where they have no responsibility, and it's all the Palestinians' fault. And it's just not an accurate description of what's happened.
Can we, this is to any one of you who feel compelled to answer, can we say that the Hamas attack succeeded in doing what it set out to do? Palestine is on the agenda in a way it was not before October 7. There is more international support than ever before.
I mean, I don't know what Hamas was trying to do. They clearly knew that there would be massive Israeli retaliation. And I mean, this is the part about, it's Hamas, it's not just they slaughtered Israeli civilians. They knew that there'd be massive loss of Palestinian civilian life as well. And they didn't care. And this is, I'm not the least bit a Hamas fan, because this is a ruthless organization that has its political goals, but is perfectly willing to sacrifice civilians on all sides to pursue it. So, I don't credit them with some brilliant strategy. This is a crisis at the moment, and the extraordinary suffering of the Palestinian people, I hope, will push for some renewal of some peace process. But I say this, very cognizant of the decades we've gone through with the Israeli government precluding any possibility of a peace process, which is why, in Israel, there's, very frequent reference to the one-state reality. It's funny how from the river to the sea is taken, oh, that's an anti-Semitic thing. That means, wipe out the Jews. But in fact, it's the Israeli government that has created a one-state reality from the river to the sea through this endless expansion of the settlements. They have tried to preclude the possibility of a second state. Now, they don't want to have equal rights from the river to the sea, which would be the antithesis of apartheid. They want apartheid. They want to keep the part that they control and subordinate the Palestinians in the part that, that they have not actively annexed. So that's, not a sustainable solution. That's the point of the apartheid label. But that was Netanyahu's strategy, and it remains his strategy. Hopefully he will not be prime minister that much longer to implement it.
I mean, I wanna kind of answer the question in terms of like what Hamas said the objectives were. The objectives were to free all the Palestinian prisoners, to end the siege, and to end the provocative attacks on Al-Aqsa Mosque. And none of those things have yet happened, so it has not achieved what it set out to do. I also want to argue that, even if Hamas was this kind of boogeyman that was like, careless about its civilians and just like actually wanted to provoke a reaction from the Israelis, I think the responsibility of killing civilians falls on those killing civilians.
Let's move over to the last part here now of about 20 minutes that we have left to looking forward and thinking about strategies. So my first question to Mohammed is, what is good activism to you? What mistakes do you see being made by the youth movement besides being distracted by semantics? How can we improve our activism?
Yeah, great question. First of all, everything I will say, and this answer is just my own personal opinion. I'm not an authority on this matter. These are just kind of my own grievances. I think for you to be a good activist, quote unquote, I don't like to define myself as an activist, honestly, but to be a good activist or a good organizer, you have to situate yourself within the collective. And you have to recognize that the collective that you are representing, which here in this question is the Palestinian people, is so invisibilized from Western media and from public rhetoric that you sometimes have to become the vessel for that rhetoric. Obviously, drawing the appropriate red lines, having it correspond with your own moral and ethical code, and not twisting or bending your principles for the sake of anything. That is very important. But also situating yourself within the collective means that sometimes you have to shake hands with people you might have petty disagreements with. You might have to organize a protest with a group you might not be on the same corner of the political spectrum as. I think one of the most mind-boggling things, and obviously there are people who have engaged this a lot more seriously than I have, but one of the most mind-boggling things to me is that Netanyahu, who cries anti-Semitism every chance he gets, can get on stage, can get on Zoom webinars, and can thank the founder of Christians United for Israel. I forget his name now. But anyway, this is like a Zionist Christian leader who is so profoundly anti-Semitic that he has said that Hitler was a hunter who was sent to help the Jews, right? There are people who believe in these crazy anti-Semitic, existential, end of times theories that the Israeli government has no problem partnering with because they have the same goal in the long term, which is expanding the Zionist ideology, blah, 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 blah. So I think for us, we have to be a little bit less purist. I'm not saying we should go shake hands with the devil. I'm not saying we should go shake hands with anti-Semites. I'm not saying we should go shake hands with people who violate our very principles. But I'm saying that sometimes within our movements, there is opportunism, there is ego, there is gatekeeping, there is personal beef, but also there's so much bloodshed, there are so many children under the rubble, and that should always be the focal point.
Let me, if I could pick up on Mohammed's comment on the anti-Semitism, because, I mean, first of all, just to sort of second your point,
John Hagee.
Netanyahu embraces Viktor Orban, the Hungarian prime minister, a blatant anti-Semite. It goes on these like long, anti-George Soros campaigns, which just are thinly veiled anti-Semitism. Why? Because, Orban embraces Netanyahu. And so, Netanyahu has long shown a prioritization for the Israeli state at the expense of anti-Semitism. But it's worse than that, because I think we're all kind of aware, this is happening very much in college campuses, but outside as well, that critics of Israel are being accused of being anti-Semitic. And this is being used to silence criticisms of Israel. Now, I should say at the outset that some critics of Israel are anti-Semitic, so we're not going to pretend that that problem doesn't exist. But many critics of Israel are mouthing completely legitimate criticism. There's lots to criticize, and the people who are willing to, misuse the charge of anti-Semitism to silence that criticism are doing a disservice to this very important concept of anti-Semitism. Now, there's, I don't know how much of you follow this. There is a very controversial definition of anti-Semitism that is promoted by something called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IRA are the initials. And this was written by actually a professor now at Bard, kind of a well-intentioned thing to try to just kind of collect data. But it is actively misused now to silence criticism of Israel. And there are three elements of the so-called working definition. There are examples given of supposed anti-Semitism. And these three elements keep popping up as the basis for silencing criticism. One is the idea of demonizing Israel. If you demonize Israel, you're anti-Semitic. Now, demonizing is what human rights groups do all the time. Our entire purpose is to demonize governments that violate human rights. That's how we kind of delegitimize them and put pressure on them to stop. So, the idea that, you're demonizing Israel and therefore you're anti-Semitic is like nonsensical. You could say this about any government in the world. A second is that if you're applying double standards, you're anti-Semitic. But they don't really want, it's not really about double standards, because, the criticism of Israel, what I outlined before in terms of the requirements of international humanitarian law are the exact same standards applied to everybody else. So they want, kind of an exemption from those standards, not equal application. But, nonetheless, they're very quick to say, oh, these are double standards. And plus, it should be okay. Maybe you care more about Israel because The US government is an active funder to $3.8 billion a year in military aid, and it provides the weapons that are used to kill Palestinian civilians. Maybe that's why you care. Does that make it a double standard, or is that just like you care because you want to avoid your nation's complicity in it? So, again, this is sort of a false charge. And the third term that is used is that if you describe the Israeli government as a racist endeavor, that's anti-Semitic, even though the apartheid that it is committing against the Palestinian population in the occupied territory is obviously a racist endeavor, And this is just another way of saying you can't call it apartheid or else we're going to call you anti-Semitic, when in fact, a straightforward, detailed, 200-plus page factual analysis applying the law shows that it is apartheid. So these are the kinds of games that this IRA definition of anti-Semitism enables. And what worries me is that, anti-Semitism is a serious problem, and it is a growing problem around the world. But if people equate charges of anti-Semitism with efforts to silence legitimate criticism of Israel, they will take the problem of anti-Semitism less seriously. And what you end up doing is, maybe the US government is marginally, the Israeli government is marginally better protected from its critics, but it's at the expense of Jews around the world. And that's not something we should stand for.
Mohammed, when you think of a free Palestine, what are you dreaming about? What does it look like for you?
There's two answers, right? There's like the answer that's quite uniform, easy answer, and then there's the other answer that's, the idealistic answer, which is not just about a free Palestine, but it's about a free world in general. But for me, ideally, I would like, first of all, to my friend Rabia, who's at Harvard, talks about this a lot. He says he calls it the 3 R's: recognition, return, and reparations. And what this means is that I would like to see all Palestinian refugees return to their homelands. I would like to see all land returned to the population it once belonged to, and the control over this land and resources be returned to us. And I would also like to see an end to militarism. Now, in the ideal world, this also means, in my opinion, finding a way to abolish prisons at large, finding a way to abolish policing. And again, I see ideal because we are a long way from abolition, but I do think it's possible. I also believe on liberated land, no one should go hungry. No one, if somebody's going to be ignorant, they should be ignorant only because they are willfully ignorant, not because they were robbed of the right to education. These are kind of my dreams. Now, obviously, when we talk about this, and when we say, like, I want all of the refugees to go back home, or I want land back, I think we should have land back in this country as well, by the way. But when we talk about this, oftentimes people will tell us, what happens to the settlers? What happens to the settlers? And throughout the years, I've had like a very flippant answer to this question. But I think, the reason why I have a flippant answer to this question, the reason I'm not really concerned with this question, is that the people oftentimes asking me about what happens to the settlers have not once been concerned with the 6 million Palestinian refugees living in refugee camps. I personally do not have any genocidal tendencies. I do not have tendencies. I don't have impulses to exclude or erase or subjugate anybody. I want us to have, our liberty and dignity. And if my liberation in somebody's mind might signal that I want their annihilation, that is more of a reflection of the system that they employ than it is a reflection of what I want. Because what I want is freedom for everybody, not just in Palestine, but everybody in the world. Not just the rich, not just the white, not just the powerful, not based on geography. And I believe truly that that's an achievable future. I truly, truly believe it. And we should not be ashamed of asking for our lands back. I mean, so many of my family who lives in Jordan in refugee camps will grow up with these images of their houses in Haifa, like their grandparents' houses in Haifa and Yafa, and they'll reminisce about these homes, and they deserve to go back. They deserve to see, and I mean, not even in Jordan, in Tul Karim, in the West Bank, in Jenin, in Tul Karim, sometimes you could even smell the Mediterranean from your kitchen, but you can't go because of the checkpoints, because of your legal status. Those people deserve their land back. And that does not mean the subjugation of others, and I do not need to make that disclaimer any longer. My freedom does not necessitate the subjugation of others.
Unfortunately, we have about 10-15 minutes left only, and there are a lot of questions. And I'm happy that there are a lot of questions. What I will do now is to kind of challenge each of you when it comes to the way forward and combining a couple of questions. So it will be with my words here. First to you, Ken. So you emphasize international humanitarian law and human rights and these kind of legal processes. In what way can you say that these courts, these international humanitarian laws, have in any kind of way played any help for Palestinians over these decades that we have seen, where war crimes have systematically been done? In what way has international law actually been used against the imperial powers, as United States, United Kingdom, or Europe in similar, but hasn't it rather been used against the poorer states, dictatorships that are not useful for the European United States anymore, like in Africa? So to give one concrete example, what about the military aid that the United States is supplying to one that we know now is systematically doing war crimes? Is there any help in international humanitarian law to stop that military aid from the United States and others?
There could be. I mean, I'm not being here naive and thinking, it's going to happen tomorrow. But I mean, first, just to the beginning of your question, we just have to recognize that international humanitarian law has utterly failed Palestinians. Okay, it has not been applied. It's there. It should be applied. You can criticize Israel, but the U.S., as we know, has repeatedly vetoed Security Council resolutions. But now, because Palestine was recognized as a state, because Palestine was able to join the International Criminal Court, finally the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction. Now, when the prior chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, opened a formal investigation into war crimes in Palestine, which include, it could be anything by a Palestinian, but also Israeli abuses, Israeli war crimes in Palestine, Trump imposed sanctions on her, which was, utterly outrageous, but that's what he did. He actually, froze her bank accounts. She would go to the store and her credit card wouldn't work. So, I mean, it was this, pettiness, but really also this willingness to utterly interfere with what should have been an independent, judicial institution. Now, she was replaced in June 2021 by Karim Khan, who is a British barrister, quite capable. He's actually, of the three chief prosecutors of the ICC, he's the one who has the most experience in the courtroom. He knows what he's doing. He then sat on that investigation for 2.5 years, until he finally held a press conference a week and a half ago, but still hasn't done anything. But that's the route. I mean, the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction. These are not complicated crimes to prosecute. I mean, the settlements themselves are war crimes. You know, Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention says that it is a war crime to transfer an occupier's population to occupied territory. That's what the settlements are. You know, Netanyahu and every Israeli prime minister before him has approved this. They're all potentially, you know, well, Netanyahu because there's a time limit, but he's vulnerable. Now, the question about the US, this is before most of your times, but there used to be a Liberian president by the name of Charles Taylor. And Charles Taylor was convicted by an international tribunal of aiding and abetting the atrocities of a rebel group known as the Revolutionary United Front in Sierra Leone. And what was that aiding and abetting? The Revolutionary United Front mined diamonds. They gave the diamonds to Charles Taylor, and Charles Taylor gave them arms, which they used to commit atrocities. So there is actually, you know, a precedent. Charles Taylor is now serving a life sentence in prison. There is a precedent for criminal prosecution by an international tribunal of aiding and abetting war crimes simply for the provision of arms. This applies 100% to the US government as it continues to arm Israeli war crimes in Gaza. So the precedent is out there. Now, am I naive and think that somebody's going to just take on the US government? You know, no. But this is, you know, what we should push for, and this is also one way to curtail that flow of arms, or at least to condition it on an end to the bombing of civilians. So, I mean, the US government totally has the capacity to twist Netanyahu's arm to get him to stop these war crimes. Yeah, they can say, we're going to stop selling you the arms. We're going to stop giving you $3.8 billion in military aid every year. We're going to stop this new supplementary request for, what is it, another $14 billion or something. You know, there's lots of leverage here, but instead the US continues to fund and continues to arm and continues to greenlight the bombing of Palestinian civilians. So that's why I think that, you know, we all have influence here because we can influence our government, but we need to push our government to use its influence to stop the killings of Palestinians.
Thank you. Mohammed, if we take into account the systematic oppression and violations that you have been talking about, both of you, and so many decades that it's been going on, and we take into account the many ways that Palestinians have resisted, I mean, I think it would be fair to say that Palestinians are having a resistance culture because there is so much of resistance in all kinds of different ways. Something that doesn't get the headlines is the sumud, the steadfastness of everyday people in refusing to leave their homes. So people have tried so many different kind of methods, right? So the question I will want to challenge you with, what kind of realistic strategy do you see for Palestinian liberation? What way to go?
It's a tough, I forgot my liberation PowerPoint at home. It's a tough question. I have to say though, like you're right, there is absolutely a myriad of ways in which people resist that do not reach international audiences because it seems history begins at their loss, at the Israelis' loss. It seems that history and the world stops at their discomfort, not just Israelis. I mean, why is it that nonviolence resistance, not just in the Gaza Strip in 2019 during the Great March of Return where a population of amputees was created by the Israeli army and Israeli snipers targeting their kneecaps and killing them while they just peacefully protested, didn't get much media coverage, and the October 7 attack did. Why did all of the diplomacy, all of the advocacy, all of the literature, all of the pleas, all of the striking not get a lot of media attention, but the plane hijacking did? Because the people that were paying a price in those two examples were not solely Palestinian. They were also Israeli. They were also European. And that must be taken into consideration. We are told time and time again that the only time the people will listen, the only time the world will make our issue a central issue is that when an Israeli or when a European is harmed. What does that tell me? What does that say to a member of a militant group in the Gaza Strip? What precedent does that set? Those things cannot just be shuffled under the rug when we have tried every single method under the sun. I mean, this country has criminalized in some states and continues to criminalize and continues to attempt to criminalize boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which is a fully nonviolent, peaceful movement of protests where we're asking people to boycott Israeli goods, to boycott Israeli institutions, etc. We are being told time and time again that no method we use, not only is that all of our methods will be targeted and criminalized and penalized and etc., but we're told that only the violent methods are the ones that garner attention. That is not a healthy precedent. I just want to make sure we're all on the same page in that regard. Now, to answer the question, I made a joke about the PowerPoint, but it's a hard question. It's a hard question to answer. I'm reminded by this quote by Assata Shakur that says, "No one in the history of the world, no oppressed people in the history of the world has ever gotten their freedom by appealing to the moral sense of their oppressor." And I think that quote rings as true as ever today. And I also am reminded by a different quote by Audre Lorde that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, in the sense that, I think I am very cynical about the International Crime Court. I mean, I'm supporting all of the efforts of people taking Israel to the International Crime Court, but I'm very cynical because, as Ken explained, they're at least to me, they're unwilling to go after the U.S. government or the Israeli government. I'm cynical. So we hold some principles and some beliefs, but I also, there's a lot of things to be taken into consideration. I also believe that there's never been a people who achieved their liberation solely through nonviolent resistance, right? That violence resistance has always been legitimate and illegitimate. Violent resistance has always been a part of liberation. But also there's a question about capacity. There's a question about the military ability, the viability of such resistance. These are all difficult questions that must be contended with. I might be naive in my answer, but I think really we need to be fighting on all fronts, and there needs to be not a rock left unturned. But I think there is something about the United States as a frontier that is so vital that all of us here who support the Palestinian cause need to find ways to transform our support for the Palestinian plight from a sentimental support into a material support. And that could mean a lot of things. But this is being here in the United States, in the heart of the American empire, is not just about amassing political education and standing on the right side of history in terms of our rhetoric. It's also understanding our role here and really the change that we can exert by pressuring the US government. And that should not be minimized.
I think that is a very powerful point to end the discussion for tonight. I know that we haven't dealt with all the questions. I know that we haven't solved all the problems. But I also know that the struggle continues. And I want to say thank you to both of you, Mohammed el-Kurd and Kenneth Roth, for being here and sharing your experiences, your knowledge, your perspectives with us. And all of you for having a respectful dialogue and interaction here. And I hope this will continue. I hope we can foster a climate at our campus where we can speak about these kind of difficult issues in a way that is respectful and that where we appreciate differences and we engage with each other. Thank you.
Thank you.